All right, welcome everyone. So glad that you could join today for our Badger Crop Connect program. I'm going to leave some of the host duties to my colleague, Kevin Jarek. He's going to take care of that. But to kind of kick off like we have done in weeks past, we're just going to take a peek here at a few of the updates, just a few local updates. So I don't know if some of you have a rain gauge picture like this, but here in southern Wisconsin, we have had a rainy week. This was just one collection from a farm rain gauge here that a picture was sent to me. We also have quite a few feed piles that have been packed and covered and sealed. In general, farmers have been able to harvest, the amount of corn for silage that they have wanted to. Maybe it took a few more acres on a few fields. Quality has been good from the reports shared with me. We've also had a chance to do some field days here, kind of later September. So we had a drone field day where we were actually seeding cover crops over the top of the corn field there ahead of corn grain harvest. And then also had an opportunity to do a rainfall simulator. This was on the no cover crop check, and then we had a cover crop check as well. So a partnership there with UW-Platteville with the Pioneer Research Team. So they have uh, those rainfall simulators that are actually put right into the landscape, so we can get a fairly scientific response to what that rainfall event is doing to that area of soil within the yellow frame. Okay, I'm gonna turn it over to Kevin now to take us right up to the rest of the program today.
All right, thank you, Josh. I'd appreciate it if you'd advance the slides as I comment about them here. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 10th Badger Crop Connect webinar of 2023. I'm Kevin Jarek. I serve as the Regional Crops and Educator for Outagamie and Winnebago counties, and I'll be your host today. The Badger Crop Connect series aims to provide timely crop updates for producers and agricultural professionals in Wisconsin throughout the growing season and is jointly sponsored by the UW-Madison Division of Extension Crops and Soils Program and the UW-Madison Nutrient and Pest Management Program. As a recipient of federal funding, UW Extension must collect information about its outreach efforts. As a part of your registration for this event, we requested that you provide your demographic information. All information that was collected is anonymous and cannot be tracked back to you. Thank you for your assistance, and we will move forward with the webinar soon. While many of you are familiar with our virtual presentations in the Zoom platform, we do have a slide here that will talk and go through a few of the housekeeping items as it relates to the experience today. Please keep your microphones muted and videos off during the webinar. The mute and video controls are on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, as you see illustrated here. Also, please feel free to type questions for our presenters into the chat box at any time. The chat box is in the bottom center of your screen. We'll answer as many questions as we can as time allows. If you have any questions or difficulties with Zoom technology, you can type your questions into the chat, or alternatively, Dan Marzou is going to assist with hosting the troubleshooting and part of it. So you can email Dan at his email that'll be included in the chat as well. If you're having difficulties with your audio, the call-in information is also provided in the chat. So if you have technical difficulties, please post those questions there. If you have issues with audio, you can also call into the webinar by dialing 301-715-8592 and then entering 995-1288-7206 as the meeting ID. So we'll go ahead and stop sharing the slides and transition here to our first presenter. While Eric is going ahead and sharing his screen, we'll let you know that today we've got Eric Rediker from Reister and Schnell and Pulaski. He is a combine specialist, and he is going to talk about combine adjustment and optimization. So Eric, can you try and share your screen as far as your presentation? There we go. All right. If we are going through the presentation today and you have a question that is really, really important, it may be best to put it into the chat, and I'll try and monitor that. If it's something that is on that point, we may interrupt you, Eric, to try and respond to that immediately. If it's something more general, we'll wait till the end with that. Eric?
Yeah,
Rediker.
that's great. That sounds good, Kevin. Hello everyone. I'm Eric Rediker. I guess a little background behind me is I do work for Research Channel. So a little heads up, all my slides are going to deal with John Deere combines. I do recognize that there's many different colors out there, and thankfully a lot of the adjustments on green combines can be the same on basically any other color out there. So a little background of me. I live by Elto, Wisconsin. If anybody knows that, that's impressive because it's an unincorporated town, but it is in Fond du Lac County. It's just north of Waupun. I was born and raised on a farm there, and I actually I'm in the process of taking over the farm from my father. I've been at Research Channel here since 2017, and I do cover all 12 ag stores that we have. I got to put this in there because yesterday was my 8th anniversary. So I'm married and I have 3 beautiful children. So, all right, getting into it here. So what I always do when I'm doing a start out or adjustments for combines, I mean, the first things first, we want to make sure that the combine is in good working or optimum condition. And so I always tell my guys, make sure you're checking all the fluids. Check your engine oil and your coolant, your hydraulic oil, and then make sure you're always checking your daily grease points. And on top of that, also, there is other grease points that have longer intervals, be it once a season or, once every 50 hours, everything like that. Another thing to always make sure that we're checking is the tires. We've had it before where, corn stalks, they do put a lot of wear sometimes on tires. So we want to make sure that we're checking those so that we're not running into issues while we're harvesting. Another thing that I always do and recommend is just taking that 5 minutes, wiping off the windows. You'll see in my slides here, in my talk, safety is a big thing. Not only is it big for John Deere, but it's a really big thing in our company too. So we want to make sure that we're being safe and by wiping off every window, not only is it good for the operator, but potentially good for any other civilians that could be around the machine too. So, and then finally, I always recommend cleaning it off. Getting a leaf blower will do a really good job of getting that extra chaff, getting the dust off the combine, so that we don't have any accidents, be it a fire or really anything that can damage that machine. So, and then where I always start on the outside. Okay. When we're doing crop changeovers, I make sure that we go around the entire machine, and we want to do this again with the engine off. Again, that's just another safety thing for me. Engine off whenever we're doing these changes. So I always kind of start from the front and work my way to the back. I start up the feeder house and I make sure that the chain is in good working condition. Be that the feeder house chain itself and also the drive chains. And then make sure the drum is in the right position that it needs to be in. After that, I work through into the feed accelerator, make sure that is in the right speed and that is also in good working condition, checking the paddles, everything like that. I didn't put it in the slide here, but another thing that goes with the feed accelerator, at least on a John Deere combine, I always make sure the stone trap's empty. And every morning I make sure that stone trap is empty. Especially when we're doing, say soybeans or anything where the cutter bar is running along the ground. We want to make sure that we're cleaning out any stones. Next, working back, I always check the concaves. Especially like in some rotor machines, we can change out from round bars to small wires. I just want to make sure that I'm running the correct piece of equipment in there, the correct concave, so I'm doing the best job possible. And then working through into my separator. just making sure that if I need spacers or that all my tines are in good shape. So that it's combing through that crop, doing the best job possible. And then finally with my residue management, am I going to be spreading that? Am I chopping it up? Just making sure that one, it's in the right speed between high speed and low speed, and that if my knife bank needs to be engaged or not. So those are the things that I start with on the outside. So then I work my way inside then. And I got to put a little plug in here because it's a really nice feature. If anybody has a John Deere combine out there, they can go find, let me see, get my highlighter, my laser pointer out here. They can go find this app up here, right up in the top corner that I have. That is called the Equipment Plus app. It is a free app from John Deere. And you can actually go through and select your harvester that you have. It does have walker machines in it. It has every rotor machine in there. And what's really nice about it is it gives you these inside harvester settings. So these would be the inside harvester settings for, say, dry corn. All right, I just pulled it up on my phone, took a screenshot, and put it in this presentation. But these are kind of set points, but remember, these are recommendations. All right, these are not gospel. And what I always do is I usually start in the middle. All right, I start in the middle of these recommendations here. And again, it's just a starting point. And then one thing to remember is that many factors can actually change these numbers. As machines get older, our concaves can wear down, our RAS bars, they can get wore. So again, these are just recommendations and just a starting point. And then, all right, so going into, the machine itself, and when we start getting crop flow through there and setting the machine, so talking about rotors, they all work best when they're full, because a rotor, how it works is grain on, a lot of the thrashing is actually done grain on grain. So we want to make sure that rotor is full and it's doing its best job possible. My next thing I do is I get out. You got to get out. You got to walk around that machine, and don't just go straight to the back of the machine and look what's getting thrown out the back. We always want to look at the header and try to calculate what we're having for header loss, because that's a very easy adjustment. If we got to change the deck plates or speed the header up or even slow it down. So then after I get done calculating what I have a loss for header wise, then I'll go to the back of the machine. But as I'm walking back there, I'm checking the ground. I'm checking what my cobs look like. Another thing too is I'm checking what the stalks are looking like. If we're going to be chopping them up, or if we're just kind of crimping them, or what, because that the harvesting is really what's setting us up for next year, is our first pass towards next year for residue management. So so I look at what's coming out the back of the combine, if I have any rotor loss or shoe loss. And then finally I go up in the grain tank and I look and see what my grain tank sample is looking like. Is it clean? Is it dirty? Where do I have to go? So those are the first things I look at. And then when I start optimizing it, okay. So when I start tweaking settings, I only do one thing at a time. So many times, you can change rotor speed or clearance, fan speed, chaffer or sieve. And if you're changing multiple things, you can actually, I've done it before, you can screw yourself up just as fast, if not faster, than getting it correct. So you want to make sure that we're making these adjustments and change one thing at a time and then go check it. And then when we're making these adjustments, it's always best practice to kind of make sure that the machine is cleaned out, so that, if we're moving the chaff, or if we're moving anything, any of the moving parts really, that they move pretty freely, and that material is not binding them or anything like that. Another thing I always tell my customers is that it's not a race. Take your time doing this. I myself love sitting in the combine seat, and when that last acre is harvested, it's a great feeling, but it's also, it's kind of a sad feeling too, just because I love being in that harvester, and we only get to harvest the crop one time, after it's on the ground, unless you have some steers that you're going to put out in it or some cattle. Once it's on the ground, it's really hard to get that back into the grain tank. So we want to make sure that we're doing the best job possible. So after we make, we change one setting, then we want to continue combining. We want to, go back and make sure the machine is full, and, then get back out, look around. Are we satisfied with the sample in the grain tank? Are we satisfied with what it looks like out on the ground outside? And then, if we want to go to a little bit more advanced optimization. So I do these all the time. I call it a power shutdown. It's a pretty fun experience, actually. I enjoy doing them. So how I do my power shutdowns is I make sure that my rotor is full and my combine is full. And I actually, if you can see here, so on a deer combine, this is our header switch, and this is our combine, our machine switch. So I got one hand or one finger each on these buttons, and then I let go of the steering wheel for a little bit, which I know is not recommended all the time, but I'll pull back on my hydro handle, and as I'm pulling back on my hydro handle, I click those off. I know some practices are actually that they just turn the key off for the entire machine. I don't recommend that. We at Richter do not recommend that, especially with the transmissions that we have on these combines now. And it's very hard on the motor. So, and by doing the power shutdown, by just pulling back on the hydro handle and turning the machine off, you're going to get a very good sense of what's happening in the back of the combine in your separator. You don't need to turn the engine completely off. I would not recommend that at all. And then after I turn my separator and my header off, I'll idle the engine down, and then before I get out, I make sure I turn off the key. Always a safety thing, to make sure that we don't end up engaging that combine when we get outside. So then, as I get outside, after I do my power shutdown, I walk around the machine again. I'm still making sure that we're not getting any header loss. And I'm looking at the cobs. When we see cobs out in the field, I love seeing whole cobs out in the field that have no kernels left on them. I feel when we see that, we're doing a very good job. When we start seeing, like, I'm going to call them quartered cobs. So if you look at the end of a cob, you cut it in quarters, you're getting like little pieces like that. That tells me that we're over thrashing, and that we can back down on some of the settings. Because all we're doing then is just getting grain damage and wasting fuel. Yeah, I just want to make sure that we're doing, checking the ground there. And after I get done checking the ground, then I'll actually go inside this cover right here. So this is going to be inside the rotor part where all my thrashing is done here. Pull that open, and I look at the chaffer below and see what the grain looks like in there. Is there any is there busted grain? Is there unthrashed grain and everything? And then I'll open up these three covers back here, and this is where my separator is. And then that's where you can see my acronym here that I have, that we call it MOG. So MOG is material other than grain. Oh, excuse me. So I want to go inside my covers here and be looking at my separator and looking at the MOG and seeing, is there unthrashed grain going right out the rotor? Because if there's unthrashed grain that's up in the back here, that's gone. It's through the combine, it's going out to the chopper and getting spread out. So we want to make sure that the MOG that we have left over in the rotor here or in the back and the separator, that there's no unthrashed or free flowing grain there. So, and after I look at what I have inside on my chaffer and on my sieves below, again, I'm just gonna make one adjustment at a time, to get my machine as optimized as I can. So final notes from me. I know it's a little quick here, but final notes from me. But one thing that I will always preach is safety. Safety is always first. It's first on my farm. It's first at this company. And then continue to check your combine performance. All right. Once we get the combine set, it's not set for the year. All right. Field conditions can change, varieties can change the way that we have to set that combine. So continue to get out and to look at what's on the ground and continue to look at your grain sample, so that we are doing the best job possible. And then finally, use the resources available. So as I shared before, there's many different apps through John Deere. I'm sure that other companies have apps to help you out. Open up the owner's manual. I know some people think that if the owner's manual is still sealed, the combine has more value. That is not true. So get out and open that owner's manual up, and use the resources available to you. I guess that's all I got for right now. Is there any questions?
All right, so I don't see any questions in the chat, but Eric, you were kind enough to share photos of your family, and that kind of reminds us there is no more wholesome industry than agriculture. I have a goddaughter who's about to turn 16, so she has her temps. They're required to have an adult, which some days I qualify as, and we're there to help them identify blind spots or point out things they're missing. When you work with clients, what is it that they're not thinking of or not doing correctly, or what's the biggest problem you come across when it comes to combine optimization? Obviously, it's going to vary from operator to operator, but are there 1, 2, or 3 themes that you're like, yep, I bet you this person didn't do that, or we better double check this?
So first thing is honestly, they don't cover a lot of the first thing that always happens every year is the grain tank, like the drains.
Okay.
No one ever puts them in, so the first little bit that they're doing, grain is spilling out of the grain tank because they didn't close the covers. Secondly, a lot of guys will say, well, these are my settings from last year, so I'm going to set it for that, where we all know, I mean, especially down by me, I know that I'm going to have lighter test weight corn by me because I didn't get as much rain this past year. So I know my combine settings are going to be different from last year. So not just going off of, well, this is what I wrote down in my book last year, and this is where I have to be. Those are probably the 2 biggest things is, just getting out and making the adjustments, not just going off of what last year was.
Sure. I think when we talk about the tank on the combine, anyone who's grown up on a farm has had an experience where someone brought a wagon back out to the field of gravity box and forgot to close the chute. If you haven't, you haven't been on a farm very long, because it's just one of those things. Haste makes waste. And you mentioned safety, which I'm glad you did, because equipment can be replaced, body parts can't. They can, but they're not going to function the same. And so thank you for leading with that message, because this is a time of year where people are under a lot of stress. They're not getting sleep. They're not getting 3 full square meals a day. And so it is a stressful time. I do want to circle back. You had brought up the leaf blower. And one of the things that Dan Smith has worked on a lot as a part of the NPM program is helping prevent the spread of herbicide-resistant weeds. When you talk about cleaning these units out, before they, if we have a person who owns a combine and they do work for others, it probably would be worth it to offer that person who is coming on your yard payment, or pay them for time to have them clean their machine off, because so that they don't bring weeds from a different client or farm that they may have worked with. Any thoughts on that?
No, I totally support that. You know, if there's a custom operator, I do recommend, you know, blowing the combine off. It doesn't take long, you know, just blow it off quick before you go to the next customer. So I totally support that, just because of, yeah, the big thing is weed resistance. So
Right. When we look at crop budgets, there's a big difference if you're paying $45 for weed control in a soybean field versus $75 because you introduced weeds unnecessarily by not taking time ahead of time. We do have a question that has entered the chat. What do you think about opening up the shoe and just using the top sieve to clean the corn?
I guess it all depends on your situation. I do have many guys that do that, just using the chaffer to clean the corn. The nice thing about corn, we can run our fans really high because we're not going to blow corn out of the back of the machine. So I don't see an issue with running, with doing that, with opening up your sieve all the way and just using the chaffer, the top sieve to clean out the corn.
Okay. We just had another comment that was added after that. We bought a leaf blower just to use on the combine. Works great. Leaf blowers have become much more affordable. The battery pack systems that go with them, the charges last longer. And so it's not just about preventing a combine fire, it's about preventing the spread of herbicide resistant weeds and biomaterial between fields. So with that, are there any last questions for Eric? If not, we want to thank you, Eric, for taking the time to be a part of our program today. If we do have any questions that come in the chat later and you're still able to remain on, great. If not, and you have to get on with your day, we very much appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Yeah, I can stay on, Kevin.
Okay. With
Thank
that,
you.
we will transition and we will be moving on and talking about fall manure management. And Richard Holupka, who is the Clark County Crops and Soils educator, is going to be our presenter today. And so he's already on top of the screen share. And so I'm going to hand it over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Kevin. It sounded like you were you were losing some bandwidth there at the very end. Just somebody give me a thumbs up. Can you hear me okay on everything?
You're fine coming through, and
Okay.
Your slide is up. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. To tie in with this fall, the one thing that was very interesting in Eric's slides is he showed those two combines. I actually ran that smaller John Deere combine, so I've been around for a couple years, just so you know that going into this conversation. So I'm Richard Holupka, been in extension for 15 years now, been in agriculture for over 45 years, and in multiple different levels, just to give you a little background. But today we want to talk about manure applications. And I don't have a lot of pictures like Eric. Eric had some very nice pictures, but I do have this one. And when I was working on a master's program, I worked on manure applications and in manure as a crop nutrient. And this is a slide I've always used, comparing the 1950s to probably the early 2000s, mid 2000s. So how equipment has changed over time. So I like to start off with, everybody on is either a farmer, agronomist, or a salesperson probably. And, just the definition of agronomy or an agronomist. And it covers a lot of different aspects in plants and producing crops and that type of thing. So it's very important, just to go through that. So as we begin here today, what what do you need to know before you begin these manure applications in the fall? As a farmer or an agronomist or as a custom applicator, do you have a soil test? Do you have a nutrient management plan? And we'll touch on that more in just a few minutes. What was the previous crop? What's the crop going to be next year? Do you know the difference? And I was flabbergasted here a few weeks ago, working with a farmer. He did not understand the difference between his fertilizer components he was applying to the field and what he was actually putting on. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes to cover that. What are the requirements for that next crop that we're going to be planting here in 2024? Does the farm have manure sample? What type of livestock? Because there's going to be the values of those nutrients in that manure are going to be different for different types of livestock. I've worked with dairy, beef, poultry, hogs, and mink already. And I mean, every time you go to a different farm, it's a different rate of that application that we have to be aware of. What is the volume? How many thousands of gallons or how many tons do we have, and how many acres do we have available to apply this product on? And basically, so before we move on we need to answer these questions. When we talk about custom applicators, I just got one slide on this. If you're a farmer or you're working with a farmer, you're the agronomist, I think there's got to be an inclusion where the agronomist, the custom applicator, and the farmer are all talking together. You need to get a hold of them, inform them of your intentions, and I know it sounds funny, but it's just like when I call my combiner, I want to get my name on that list, even though I might be at the bottom of the list the whole time, but I want to be on the list. You have to have an NMP available so that applicator knows the application rates. I know a lot of people, want to say, well, a nutrient management plan is, I don't need it. But I think it's a very valuable tool, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. You need to have maps where we're going to be applying that with setbacks. If there are setbacks, near a creek, is there a tile inlet, these different things, we need to know that. That custom applicator needs to know that. And if you have a nutrient management plan, you'll have these rates, setbacks, and maps all in that tool. So an NMP is a must for that applicator because you want to avoid either over or under applications, also complaints and lawsuits. It becomes that tool that provides some protection for both the farmer and that custom applicator. So what is the difference between plant food or plant nutrients versus fertilizer? A fertilizer is a material that contains plant food. It can be a manure, a biosolid, commercial fertilizer, compost, residues. It could be just basically any product that's mined or an organic product that can provide that crop nutrients, those 17 essential nutrients that every crop requires. Pounds of fertilizer, this is the conversation I had a few weeks ago. He was putting on 200 pounds of nitrogen, he kept telling me. And I said, boy, that's a lot of nitrogen. Plus he had put on other fertilizer prior to planting. And I just thought, well, after asking about 5 questions, I found out he was not putting on 200 pounds of nitrogen. He was putting on 200 pounds of urea, not 200 pounds of N as he kept telling me he was only putting on 92. So just an example. So triple 19 is a very common fertilizer. Just understand that farmer said to me, he says, well, I thought it was 100% nitrogen. Urea was 100%. So if I put on 200 pounds, I was putting on 200 pounds of nitrogen or N. No, it's a fraction. So like a triple 19 is here, you're putting on 38 pounds of N, 38 pounds of P, and 40 pounds of K. So let's just take a look at a dairy manure. We're going to use a 4 to 11% dry matter. I'm going to use book values off of my handy facts that I always keep right here at my desk. And basically, if we apply 10,000 gallons of manure, of that dairy manure, using those BIC values, we're going to apply about 100 pounds of N, 60 pounds of P, and 170 pounds of K. That is the plant food or the nutrients that crop would have available for next year. So I want to touch just a minute on a nutrient management plan. Every farm is required by law in Wisconsin following the 2008 Clean Water Act to have a nutrient management plan. And there's a lot of resistance, and the politicians put in some wording in this that unless you took some type of assistance, you were not required to do it. However, from my aspect, this is a management tool. And I think it's a very important management tool. And if you're a farmer listening today and you maybe aren't aware of it, you know, it's worth having a conversation with an agronomist, an extension educator on how to go about setting this up. It's that management tool. It's going to take those soil tests, your rotation history, maps, and everything. Plus, it's going to give you those recommendations for that crop that you're going to be planting year after year. And I just, you know, if you're in the business of crop production or in livestock production, if you're not measuring what you're doing year to year, you're missing a key component or tool to manage that crop. You know, and again, I'm just reinforcing, I strongly encourage people to consider it. The general population we have today, they view things much differently. And, you know, it's not like everybody had a connection to the farm in 2023. It's becoming very, very limited. And basically that document, that nutrient management plan, and I've had it happen here in Clark County, where that was a CYA document that prevented lawsuits against the farm. So that's why, as an agronomist, making recommendations to a farmer, if you have that in a nutrient management plan and it's an approved plan through NRCS or a land conservation office, this is a tool that you can use to kind of provide you with some protection. So I invite you as an agronomist, a salesperson, to encourage farms. You know, farmers and agronomists, you know, should know what the NPM is. And it is very important. I think even if a farmer is not going to develop his own nutrient management plan, I think it's very important for salespeople, agronomists, even farmers to attend one of these classes. It's going to give you a lot of information. It's going to answer a lot of these questions that maybe you have in your mind, but just don't know who to ask and understand. Plus, you're going to learn, it is a computer program, what a lot of this is done on, and I think it's very valuable to expose yourself to that type of training. So let's go to fall manure applications. There's some key things here we really need to consider. So we'll assume the farm has an NMP. It's a dairy farm. And in this example, it's a 4 to 11% dry matter manure. Now we need to know what crop. We're going to grow corn silage following a legume forage crop. Very common, you know, in a livestock operation here, a dairy operation. So first thing we need to know is what are the required plant nutrients, plant food we're going to need for that crop. If our goal is about 20 to 25 tons of as-fed silage, probably 30-35% dry matter. You know, basically, if you have a soil test, you know, it's very valuable because that gives us a starting point. For this example, we're going to assume that the pH, P, and K are at optimum levels on this farm. It's a medium yield potential soils, and that goes back to my background here in Clark County. But I mean, you can translate this to other yields, again, using the FastFacts, or if you have a soil test with a Wisconsin Soil Lab, certified lab, it's going to have that recommendation. So for this field, what we're talking about, using my FastFacts, our yield, for that potential yield, we need about 160 pounds of N, 80 pounds of P, and 125 of K. And there's two methods basically of applying manure, and it can be any time during the year, just not fall. But basically we can approach the nitrogen rate for that crop or the phosphorus rate. So, but we have to also consider that legume credit. And because this is a legume credit coming, you know, into this crop of corn silage in 2024, we're going to be allowed about 90 pounds of N for that legume forage that we're going to be taking out. So we take that 160 minus the 90. So for this example, we need about 70 pounds of additional N for corn silage. And basically, if we take 7,000 gallons of manure and apply it on that field, we're going to supply plant food of about 70 pounds of N, 36 pounds of P, 119 pounds of K. You know, and basically the question I have for you as salespeople, agronomists, and farmers, will this grow that 25 tons of corn silage? The answer is we could be a little short. We could be a little short of P and a little short of K. In the past, you know, that 44 pounds of P and 66 pounds of K, you know, in the olden days, we had a lot of dry starters. Today, there's a lot of liquid starters. So we're not applying as much fertilizer and plant food at that, in that 2x2 or in furrow. You know, the in furrow becomes very difficult because we can't apply that much because of some of the salt concerns. So this may be a time when, as a management decision is made, we may need to apply some DAP or some potash to bring that up to the level we need. Now let's look at using the P rate method of applying manure on this same example. We had an 80-pound P requirement, and there is some rounding here in my math. You know, just so you understand, I round up and down a little bit, but it's going to be about 13,000 gallons of dairy manure. So now we're going to be applying 130 pounds of N, 80 pounds of P, 221 pounds of Consay. You know, and then the question you ask is there a problem? A lot of people would say no. Well, depends upon the soil types we're looking at here. At 130 pounds of N, we're probably a little excessive. If we're in some soils that can allow that nitrogen to move through that profile very easily, and we have nitrate concerns in well water, it would be a concern of mine. It would be something I would express. But we've covered our P requirement. I'm not overly concerned by excessive K. It becomes part of that soil profile. It's very stable in the soil. So there's not a big concern there. Now, what that NMP will do is it's going to provide that P index. So when you put this information into that computer, it's going to generate, based on tillage, slope of the soils, P levels of that soil sample, and that potential of soil erosion, you know, are we going to have a problem? At the end, when you run an NMP and you run a P index on a field, it's going to tell you if we exceed a P index of 6, it's going to say to you, hey, we've got to maybe make some changes in this recommendation. So I'm going pretty fast. So if you've got questions, just hang on to them. We'll get to them. But I want to do one more example. And we're going to look at that cornfield now, the same field, the following year now in 2025. And again, we're shooting for that 25-ton as fed corn yield. The application rate, we're going to look at the N application rate of 160 pounds. That's going to equal 16,000 gallons of dairy manure. And basically, when we look at that, we've got our 160 pounds of N. Now we're exceeding our P level by about 16 pounds. Again, as I said before, that K level isn't a big concern. If we roll back into another forage crop, grass, alfalfa, clover, grass, that K requirement can be used in those future years. But my concern is this, you know, at 16,000 gallons, you know, is there concerns that we're applying? Could we have some runoff? Could we have some other concerns in the fall of the year that we should address? And, you know, I'll touch on this a little bit more as I wrap up in the end. Some other considerations here. You know, where are we at for soil moisture? A year like this, we're extremely dry. You probably not as much concern if we would compare it to when we'd have a normal year with rainfall. You know, erosion factors play into this, tillage, and then again, that's where that P index, when you put in that nutrient management plan, it's a really good tool for the agronomist, the farmer, and that custom applicator if he's working in close hands with this group, the 3 people. Hey, we may need to make some changes here. So we look at P rate, and again, we're back to that 13,000 gallons of manure. Again, with the type of moisture we had this year, it's probably not as much of a concern. We're going to be right there is what we're going to be applying, about 130 pounds of N, 80 pounds of P, 221 pounds of K. So what are our concerns here? Well, if we are shooting for those high yields, we could be a little short of N. That higher application, I've spoken with a lot of large dairies, and they're actually telling me they're seeing some negative impacts when we exceed maybe that 10,000, 12,000 gallon range. I mean, there's no research to back this. These are just farmers that I'm talking to that say, hey, as I increase these rates, I have these concerns in crop production. So it's something we may want to think about. Now we can say we're short of N on this application. Now we might have some pop-up starter or some other starter we're adding to cover that need. And maybe if we are using a starter of some type, we could decrease this requirement and not just apply it all as manure. The other factor that a lot of people don't like to think about is if we got a 3 to 4% organic matter soil, depending upon weather conditions during the growing season, we can supply a lot of N off of that's going to be mineralized over that growing season through the organic matter. So just something else to think about as we're doing some of this crop production planning. The other option is we can maybe back that manure down just a little bit, and we could do a side dress application, or maybe some of that, we're doing some starter fertilizer. Maybe we could make that difference up in that also. Another important thing question that comes up is incorporation versus not incorporating. And there's a lot of new tools out there, a lot of new toolbars, that type of thing. Some people prefer tillage, some do not. That's going to be a choice of every operator and how they manage their cropping system. There are some really excellent low impact incorporation bars. I know I was talking with Kevin Erb the other day. The thing that I really see cropping up on a lot of farms is these splash bars, or these, bars that are just applying the manure on the surface. And part of that comes too because there are a lot of people are looking at no-till systems. And so what if I'm in a no-till system? What do I need to do to try to prevent some issues if I'm not incorporating this manure in the fall of the year? Well, 30% residue is suggested. Another option is we could have planted a cover crop, or after we apply the manure, we can plant a cover crop. And I've had it already where they've had systems where they've planted the cover crop, it's actually growing, and we come in with the surface application. The advantage of that cover crop and that residue is it's going to prevent runoff from that surface. It's also going to maybe help grab some of that N. Another thing that we're going to touch on in just a minute is soil temperature, but I'll leave that till then. So what is our N loss if we just apply it on the surface? There's always that concern. Well, I'm losing N. Well, the first thing about N and losses is we never truly lose it. It's just in a form that the plant cannot use. And much of it, if we've got a 30% residue out there, or we've got a growing cover crop, that could be 3 pounds of N or less per 1,000 gallons of N applied. So it's minimal is where I'm going to start this conversation. But there's always going to be trade-offs. I want to be in a no-till system. I've got high slopes. I need to have residue present, prevent soil erosion. So there's always trade-offs. There's never one system that fits everything perfectly. So we can adjust these applications if we have concerns. Soil temperature. So today, if I was applying manure after corn silage, some of that N is probably going to be converted from an ammonia form to a nitrate form because the soil temperatures are greater than 50 degrees. A soil temperature needs to be at 50 degrees or less because that's when these soil microbes will slow down and there's less chance of that ammonia conversion to nitrate. Nitrate, understand, soils have a negative charge, and nitrogen in the ammonium form is a positive charge, so there's an attraction to soil particles. But as it converts to nitrate, nitrate has a negative charge, so it's not as stable in that profile. And depending upon your soil type, your finer soils are probably going to be less of a concern compared to some of your more coarse soils. So that cover crop again, I'll come right back to cover crops. Here's another good application where if you had a cover crop there, it's going to help if that soil temperature is greater than 50 degrees, that cover crop that's growing may take up some of that and prevent some of that conversion, to nitrate, and it probably closes that window a little bit on that evaporation and that volatilization loss that you might have occurred surface applying just on a surface of soil, is the best way to describe it. It's also going to help reduce that erosion, going to help reduce concerns of runoff. And, if we get a rain event, it's also going to prevent that concern, where if we had surface applied manure, we had any tremendous rain event, multiple inches, where we could have concerns of that running off the field. The addition of cover crops also are going to help promote that soil health that we're all trying to improve as we manage these soils. Live roots in the ground is the best thing we can have going for us. It's going to capture some of that N here in the fall, put it in an organic form, and then next spring we can either harvest that, put it into a bunker, or it could be killed, and then that will regenerate back into that soil during the next growing season. Another option, when we have greater than 50 degrees soil temperatures, there are some commercial products out there that we can add to that manure that are going to slow down this conversion to nitrate. Just remember, when you start purchasing these products, are they viable and do they work? N-Serve, I'm not trying to promote this product. It's a product that has a lot of history, has a lot of data behind it, and it seems to work in manure applications and in other commercial nitrogen applications. So you just have to remember, to have that stable N available next spring, that soil temperature has to be less than 50 degrees when we're applying that manure. This fall, it's looking, the trend right now for the next few weeks, listening to the weathermen, it's going to be warmer. And I know there's going to be a lot of manure applied. So there's a lot of things we need to think about here in the next week or so. Because when it stops raining here today, get the sun out for a couple days, I know everybody's going to crank up harvesters again. Maybe combines will be cranking up, and that manure applications will also be cranking up. So some of the key points, kind of take-home points, just so you're aware, every farm in the state of Wisconsin is required to have a nutrient management plan, but there are some loopholes. Water quality concerns from the general public. This is number one on every politician's wish list, and I cannot emphasize enough why that nutrient management plan is that first line of defense for both the farm, the agronomist, and I will also include the custom manure applicators. This is your defense if the general public comes after you. And always remember, as I said before, the general public has a view of farmers. You have to know the difference between, you have to know the plant food requirements for a crop and what's available in the fertilizer you're applying. That fall manure applications can be applied at N and P rate. Again, the P rate can also be, that can also be backed down depending upon the level of your soil test P in those fields. I've had a lot of people, they're telling me they're maxing their applications at 10,000 gallons. I'm not saying that's what you have to do, but again, that's a common theme, talking to farmers in general. And I've got a lot of other farmers, smaller farmers, where they don't exceed those rates. They do have to maybe purchase a little nitrogen or something else on that corn crop. That soil temperature needs to be less than 50 degrees to provide a stable N in the soil for next spring. If it's greater, consider cover crops. The live roots promote health, reduces erosion, and can also help stabilize that N. Or the other consideration is, if you want to preserve as much N as possible, you need to do some, maybe push a pencil on economics. There are some commercial products out there that could help you out. And we need to manage those applications. If they're incorporated or they're surface applied, we need to be aware of the weather, the soil moisture, and some other factors. And why is this important? Back when I started in extension, we worked extensively in the Mead Lake area, and that was very common occurrence. And so you can see those two pictures. The most common occurrence there was soil erosion. And this picture here with the soil erosion, why is that soil eroding off the field? One, there's tillage. Two, that farmer has mismanaged that field, where at this time, his field is lower than the township road ditch. So the water is coming down the road ditch off a hill. It goes right into the field. It's a path of least resistance. So there's a lot of management things here in just these two pictures I could allude to. But last but not least, you need to be an agronomist and a farmer. You have a profession, and you need to understand your profession. You need to know that NMP is not just something you throw on the shelf and forget about. It's a management tool that you need to address. I also, I like Warren Buffett. I read a lot of stuff in the morning, and one of his comments one day when I was reading an article was, to succeed in life, you must expand your knowledge. I've had a lot of people in my profession and other professions in agronomy. You got a tech school degree, you got School of Hard Knocks degree, you've got a college degree. It doesn't matter. Every day you need to expand your knowledge. As a farmer, don't be afraid to take a couple days off the farm and spend 2-3 hours in an NTC or a tech school classroom and learn about nutrient management planning. If you're a salesperson working in agronomy, maybe at some point you say, hey, I'd like to become a CCA. Expanding your knowledge is always positive, and you need to learn every day. And I'll be brutally honest, I don't know everything. I've seen a lot of things in 40 to 50 years in agriculture, but I'll tell you this, if the day you quit learning is the day they might as well put the headstone up and call it quits. We need to keep expanding. Don't be afraid to attend training. Always remember, people are watching everything you do. And while you know what you're doing, they always know more than you do. And that's basically where that line goes. And the last thing I threw in here, I kind of forgot about this. I think this manure advisory website is extremely important when we're talking about fall manure applications. This will tell you your soil moistures, the threat of rainfall for a number of days forward and backward. And it's really, when you're working with custom applicators, agronomists, and farmers, it's a good tool, another good tool to have in your toolbox. Just want to say, wrapping up, good luck. Be safe, as Eric mentioned. Safety is very important during this crazy time of the year.
All right. As far as questions are concerned, Richard, there was an earlier reference you made, and that is obviously tied to the fact that Richard has the Milwaukee Brewers on his mind. He made a reference to Christian Yelich averages. And so those who don't know, Christian Yelich is batting .275. He has 19 home runs this year, 75 runs batted in, and his on-base slugging percentage is .809. So just like Yelich, Richard shows up when it counts. As far as the other questions, might be worth touching on PPNT, PSNT soil testing to help determine how much N from that fall manure is still sticking around. Yes, with our dry weather, especially in our corn crops, I can tell you from research I've done with alternative forages, we have found triple-digit residual N in the soil the following spring. Richard, do you want to take 30 seconds? We're at 1:30, but it is a question. I'll let you respond.
Okay, so yeah, a dry year, 2012, 2023. You get these dry years, it's worth investigating what's left out there in the fall of the year. Another one that I really like, if I have any concerns come June 1, June 15 of next year is that pre-side dress test. You know, what if we put manure out there and then we had weather conditions, you know, early in the growing season, wet, cool, whatever. That's another one. So, I mean, yes, you know, any of these things that you can do this year. Now with the winter coming on and weather coming on, we don't know what it's going to be, but at least you'll have something in your toolbox for next spring. But maybe next spring you'll go, well, that's maybe not going to work, because there's one thing about nitrogen levels in soils. Every 24 hours they can vary. And I know, Kevin, you'd probably agree with that, you know, because that there's such a transition with N levels, and that's why we don't soil test for it on a regular basis. But we do have these two tests available to us, and they're very good tools to have in the toolbox.
I concur 100%. Real quickly, before we lose too many people, first off, we want to thank you. As far as your CCA credits, you can scan the square that you see here, or you can put your CCA number in the chat box. I'll leave this up or ask for this to be left up for 10 more seconds. We have one more slide, and it is important because a lot of you are attendees of the past pest management update, the soil and water meetings, and the agronomy update, which last year were combined into one as far as the Badger Crops and Soils update meeting. And we have a slide that talks about those locations and dates. So on November 27th, we're going to be in Barneveld at the Deer Valley Lodge. The 28th, we're going to be in Fond du Lac at UW Oshkosh. And that's the Fond du Lac campus. This is the session that if you choose to consume this knowledge via the Zoom and online option, as opposed to going into a site, a physical building, mark your calendar for November 28th, because that's the Zoom session. On November 29th, we'll be in Stevens Point at the Holiday Inn for another live session, and it'll wrap up on November 30th in Eau Claire at the Best Western Plus. And so the theme for this year is balancing innovation and sustainability. So as is always the case, we're going to have the opportunity for you to hear from UW faculty to present the most recent research findings, highlight the most impactful resources for ag producers around the state. And we're looking forward to seeing all of you pick which location, time works best for you and participate in that event. So with that, unless there are any last questions that made their way into the chat, I believe our next session here is going to be on October 11th. And at that time, we will have pest and entomology report from 2023 and considerations for 2024. So until then, thanks for joining us today. Have a good week.